Thanks, Chris. And thank you everybody for coming along tonight to help celebrate the beginning of the celebrations of 90 years of Bathurst War Memorial Carillon, which was officially opened on the 11th of November 1933 and dedicated the following day to the men of Bathurst and district who'd served their king and country in the Great War. Now the Carillon became known as it says up there, a singing tower, which was a memorial with a voice, really important, a voice to call to the skies that we remember. We remember not only in the morning and at the going down of the sun. Whenever the bells ring, we will remember them. That was said in 1933 before they'd even heard the bells, but ever so important. Bathurst became known as the Carillon City, and our War Memorial became and remains an iconic feature at the heart of our city. This presentation is going to explore the story of the War Memorial, and those of you who've heard me talk about it before, it's not the same, so there's new information, a lot of different things here. From its first consideration of the memorial in 1915, so this is a story that goes over 100 years, not just the 90 years of celebrating the fact that it was opened and is still there, but the fact that it took over 100 years to get to this point. But as I begin this presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which Bathurst is set, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, works excellent. Okay, we go back to 1915 because in late 1915 the Mayor, H.C. Beavers, faced heavy losses at Gallipoli, including his own son, and he suggested there should be a memorial to the fallen at some time in the future. At a meeting of the council on the 20th of October that year, Alderman Lowe offered a flagpole and the ladies of Bathurst worked to procure a flag. And that 80-foot high white flagpole was erected in the centre garden of King's Parade as it was at the time. 1919, there was the idea that yes, maybe now's the time to have a war memorial. But that was rejected because at the time, as you can imagine, there were still repatriations going on. The people were still trying to come to terms with all that had happened and the impacts of that war in the previous 5 years. And then in 1920, they finally got around to saying, well, okay, we're going to have a memorial. They formed a committee and couldn't decide on what sort of memorial we might have. Could we have a hall? Could we have some sort of structure? Or, as other people suggested, would it be better to spend that money on housing for widows and children and support returned diggers? However, things did progress, and in 1921 a decision was made as to the form a memorial should take. And the winner was a soldiers' memorial to be erected in the middle of King's Parade. And they stated at the time that it needed to be classic and in keeping with the beauty of the parade. And as you can see there, King's Parade looked very different, with the gardens down the centre. At that time, the Soldiers' Memorial for the Boer War was at the far end, and the Evans Memorial. So they envisaged something in keeping with that arrangement in the centre of the parade. So a design competition, what else would you do but a design competition, where the first prize of £100 was offered and conducted in 1921. They got 21 designs submitted, and they awarded a first prize to a Mr. Cool, K-O-O-L, of Brisbane. But unfortunately his design had not provided all the necessary submissions and he couldn't be contacted. So there they were, still no memorial design. So in 1922 it was decided that they would simply ask Gilbert Doble, Sydney designer of the Evans Memorial and the soldier in the Boer War Memorial, if he would come up with a design for King's Parade, which indeed he did. Whoops. Oh, come on, it's got to do that. All right. We'll do it that way. Okay, and that's what he came up with. His idea was to have this tall column with a figure representing justice on the top of it, but it wasn't received with any great enthusiasm for, I don't know, reasons I could agree with, as people thought that perhaps we just don't want another piece of statuary in the middle, even though he was well recommended and had designed the other two aspects of the memorial. So the whole thing lingered on until 1926. Now, there was a lot of frustration at that point because they hadn't decided whether they were actually going to accept this design, whether they were going to build it, what on earth they were going to do about it. And so a new committee was formed. Always get rid of the old one, start with a new one. And that was established in July 1926. They decided to reject this when, it's not going to work, Wendy, oh dear, I can do it that way, when along came George Hoskins. Now, George was a committee member. He proposed that we have a War Memorial Carillon, which must have confounded people no end, because nobody really knew what a carillon was. There wasn't one in Australia at that time. George was the eldest son of George J. Hoskins, who, together with his younger brother Charles, was instrumental in the development of the Australian steel industry, iron and steel industry. George was an industrialist, and he was also an amateur astronomer who was living at Uara on the O'Connell Road at that particular time. In 1925, George and his family went to England, and whilst he was there, he heard and saw the bells of the carillon in Loughborough. Loughborough had a carillon of 47 bells and had been constructed and opened just a couple of years earlier than that as a war memorial, with the bells being cast by the local foundry of John Taylor and Son. However, it would appear that Hoskins took a while to think about this because he didn't go and talk to tailors. He didn't do that at all. He must have got himself back to London, where he went and visited the Croydon foundry of Gillett and Johnston. Now, that was a foundry that cast bells for clocks and schools, churches, and apparently also cast the bells for the Wellington Carillon in New Zealand. And their suggestion was that we should have perhaps a 23-bell carillon, which is the minimum size for a carillon, and it could go in a 100-foot tower. So that's what he came back and presented to the committee in August. But because there was no carillon, they had a lot of trouble explaining what a carillon was. Now, Bathurst was really fortunate because in December 1923, Sydney University had decided that they would build a War Memorial Carillon. And in May 1925, had accepted Taylor's tender for 49 bells. A frame capable of carrying 53 bells, a clavier, and a practice clavier. And Professor E.R. Home, who was a professor of English at Sydney University, visited Loughborough in early 26 to view the foundry and gain an insight as to how this might work and what might be the most appropriate place for them to house their carillon of bells. Excuse me. Professor Home and the university experience would be invaluable to Bathurst. Before ordering their bells, Sydney had raised the entire funds necessary for the bells, largely because of faculty allegiances, families, corporate donations, all of those sorts of things. And that certainly was not going to be the Bathurst experience. Bathurst was going to have a very different experience with absolutely no benefactors whatsoever. Small item appeared on page 9 of the Daily Telegraph on the 26th of August 1926, and it prompted the attention of Mr. Henry Daly, who was a Sydney import agent who was handling the university order. He sent a copy of the item to Taylor's, and with the request that specifications of what you think would be the most suitable figure as a competitive price, for I am always on the lookout for competition from Croydon, which I may have to meet. So he'd snuck in, he'd seen that there was this idea of 23 bells. He'd found out from Hoskins as to where he'd got the quote from and snuck in there with Taylor's. So in December, the foundry, Taylor's, really got in on the act, and they sent a quote to Henry for 35 bells. Skip that for a moment, just park that idea, because they still had to get that to Bathurst. In February 1927, Mr. Robert Peacock, who was the former manager of the Bathurst Experiment Farm and secretary of the Soldiers Committee, and this is where I should have another slide, explained the idea of raising funds for the Carillon, and the idea was that everybody would be able to contribute. Everybody in Bathurst, all the surrounding centres, were asked to play an active role and contribute something. They came up with the slogan of work for it, save for it, give for it. And the first fundraising activity which enabled everyone to participate was a band continental held on Wednesday the 9th of February 1927 in Makati Park. And band continentals or band fetes were very common after the opening of Makati Park in 1890. These were the opportunities for the band to perform in the rotunda in the park, a few stalls around to raise money, usually for the band, for new instruments, uniforms, etc., but also for other occasions. And on this particular occasion, it was for the Carillon. There were lots of other things that happened over the coming years, and a few of them are up there. You know, concerts, and I can't read what I've written. So concerts were there, dances, card parties, anything that people could think of that would raise some money. There were hair drives, as in big rabbits, you know, see how many of those we can get. There were sporting events, and all the little villages around contributed. They all had their own different activities. There were market days, all raising bits of money for the War Memorial. Little did the committee or the community realise at that time that fundraising efforts were going to go on for over 10 years. They thought they were going to have this knocked over fairly quick smart, and in about 4 years they would have a Carillon with bells. Mr. Peacock was a pretty savvy sort of a fellow, because he was absolutely adamant that construction would only proceed when the funds were available. So how different to the Sydney experience was that? Only as funds would become available. Okay. So, in July, now that's all fairly faint, I think, that's all right. In July 1927, the committee accepted the tender of John Taylor and Company for a supply of a Carillon of 35 bells at a cost of £3,040. The bells were then ordered with delivery instructions for Sydney on the 1st of September 1928. However, the casting of the bells was held over for 3 months while appropriate inscriptions were prepared. The largest bell is inscribed, "Thus Bathurst and her surrounding villages honour their men of 1914, 1918, lest we forget." The second largest bell is inscribed, "Thus Bathurst and her surrounding villages honour their men of 1914, 1918. Sorry, that's me reading the wrong one. "To the ever-glorious memory of our fallen comrades, greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." And the third largest bell simply carries the Red Cross emblem in honour of the war nurses. The remaining bells were inscribed with the names of the villages and bore the coat of arms of Bathurst and also the emblem of Taylor's Bell Foundry. And there were 3 bells that were unnamed at that time. So, with the Carillon of 35 bells on order, attention turned to the campanile, or the bell tower, in which to house the Carillon. Once again, Bathurst was able to benefit from the Sydney University experience because they contacted Sydney architect John D. Moore, who was approached to design a suitable tower that would reflect the purpose of the memorial. Bathurst was really fortunate in the choice of that architect because Moore was a highly regarded artist, a returned serviceman, and an instructor in design and draftsmanship in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Sydney. In addition, he had been involved in the establishment of the War Memorial at the university, and which was also built by Taylor's. But what he'd done in Sydney was he had designed a separate bell tower for the Sydney University Carillon. They didn't know what they wanted to do with it, so he designed a tower, but unfortunately, or or not, as the case may be, it was decided that the carillon would go into the existing tower in the old buildings of the quadrangle. So Moore visited Bathurst for a site visit in November 1927 and proposed the site in the centre of King's Parade with a tower of 100 feet. So everybody's talking the same sort of language here. It was noted that that authorities were of the opinion that the best listening area would be 500 to 600 feet away, and making Makati Park an ideal listening area. That might well have been the case at the time, and there have even been reports of people on top of Mount Panorama hearing the bells at night. We all know that if you're even close by, you don't hear so well because of the traffic and all the noises of the modern world. So Moore subsequently designed what would be the only tower specially built for a War Memorial Carillon in Australia. He submitted 2 designs, the one that we've got, and another one that was similar but somewhat wider, is all I can tell from the pixelated designs. But this one they chose. Work began immediately, or almost immediately, on the foundations, and they were completed by the end of May, despite the greater depth that was anticipated. What was necessary was to put down 4 concrete piers 47 feet below the surface until they got to the bedrock. And that, of course, was all dug, pick and shovel, so it was quite an operation. And I'm absolutely in awe of this whole building process because if you think about how quickly they managed to get things together, it's quite mind-blowing, especially when you compare it to some of the things that happen these days. So they went down 47 feet, came up, and then they had a big block 6 feet higher above the ground level that was 26 feet square, and this large lump of unsightly reinforced concrete sat there for a while because they didn't have any money to fix it. But they did raise sufficient money through a spring carnival and a Miss Bathurst competition and the donation of 500 bricks from Mr Dawson, the Kelso brickmaker, and the construction of the base to the platform at the top of the stairs was completed by the end of 1929 at a cost of £966, 11 shillings and 1 penny, to be precise. Okay, so then they decided that they needed to raise some more money, obviously, and they had a penny drive in January 1930, and the idea was for everyone just to bring their pennies, 1 or 2, or as many as could be spared, and try and cover that big platform at the top with pennies. Well, they didn't manage to do it, and they didn't manage to raise sufficient funds. So over the next couple of years, enthusiasm waned, the effects of the Depression took hold. It was a really difficult time to be raising money, but interestingly enough, around that time, it was also the time that the people of Bathurst raised the money to build the ambulance station. So this was a community that was really, really working towards what it needed. The community became really frustrated that after 4 years, the promised memorial they had worked so hard for remained incomplete. Opposition became more vocal the longer it stayed there, with the incomplete memorial being described by committee member Mr Webb as being the most abused thing in Bathurst. Now, I don't think the kids of Bathurst thought that, because that turned into a bit of a playground. There's lots of stories about kids remembering climbing up the stairs, jumping off the edge, stories of people who would meet their friends at that particular area. Although £5,000 had been raised and expended, it was estimated that a further £3,600 was required to build the tower. Mr Peacock recognised how hard it was for people, so he asked for ideas. In March 1932, and that's the picture at the top there, the Mayor, Alderman Griffin, appealed to the people of Bathurst and District to complete the tower. He also reminded his fellow aldermen that if the tower was not built, it would be their duty to have the base removed and not let the eyesore continue to be a blight on the beauty of King's Parade. Clearly not a man to mince words. Although the committee only had £103 in the bank, the Mayor's calls appeared to have galvanised action, and building resumed in April 1932. With the resumption of work, a building committee was appointed to carry out the construction, and the committee consisted of Jim Newton, Mr. Bartlett, Hopper, Stanley and Sproul. Mr. Newton became the clerk of works and Mr. Sproul was the foreman of the bricklayers and labourers, and those men brought with them all the tools and necessary equipment and scaffolding. Organisations and groups were asked to purchase bricks to enable work to continue, and a special appeal was made to sporting bodies and young children. The committee was keen that every child in Bathurst should buy a brick and have it built into the tower. 1,000 bricks could be purchased and built in for £8, 6 bricks for 1 shilling, and 1 brick for 2 pennies. By the start of May 1932, the tower had reached a quarter of its height, as you can see in the lower picture there. People were starting to realise what it was going to look like, and more fundraising continued. But it stopped there due to lack of funds. The tower was finally completed on the 24th of April 1933, and that afternoon Mr. Peacock went to the top of the tower, placed the last 6 bricks into it, and the peal of bells from All Saints accompanied it. It was a jubilant occasion for Bathurst. The tower was finished. Work progressed after that. They had to get the bells in, and you can see how they did that by windlass up through the centre of the tower. Everything went up through the middle. Then they built in the floors above once the frame and the bells were in, and eventually the work was finished. Bells were in June 1933, 4 years after they'd arrived in Bathurst, where they had been sitting in Webb's warehouse. The following day, Anzac Day, was the first Anzac Day service to be held at the War Memorial Carillon. It was held in the morning. It was a dawn service. Started with Reveille being played by the official bugler Corporal C. Holland from the top of the tower at 4 o'clock in the morning. There was a parade of 60 local diggers that were called to attention at the base at 4:30, and it was attended by 300 people. Wreaths were laid, 2 minutes silence was observed in memory of the fallen, prayers were offered by the Reverend Doust, and a brief address was given by the President of the local sub-branch of the Returned Soldiers and Sailors Imperial League of Australia. It was an impressive, simple ceremony, concluded with the sounding of the Reveille. And that structure remains very much the structure of dawn service in Bathurst as we know it now. The citizen services were held in the Burlington Theatre up the road here, but they started that day with a procession that gathered on King's Parade at 11 o'clock and marched up to the theatre. That was led by the district band, followed by groups of young people, scouts, cubs, school groups, and the Junior Red Cross girls from Bathurst Public School. Okay, so Armistice Day, the work was finished. Armistice Day, 11th of November 1933, 15 years after the end of the Great War, Bathurst Carillon was officially opened. And in that top picture, you can see the aftermath of the ceremony of remembrance in the morning. That was preceded by a march of 150 returned soldiers, and perhaps they're the soldiers that are in that photo that's in the Carillon that some of you will see. And a mounting of the guard, 11 o'clock, the hour was struck and the big bell tolled once to signal 2 minutes silence. 120 wreaths were laid that day and laid around the parapet, and the ceremony concluded at the last post, once again with Corporal Holland up the top. And to get to the top was a series of ladders. But the flagpole that you might remember from the centre of King's Parade that was put there in 1915 was placed at the top, and for many years it was up there, the flag was raised and flown from there. 150,000 people, sorry, not 150, let's just make that 15,000. A few too many. 15,000 people then gathered in Russell Street for the official opening, which was in the afternoon. Once again, we had bands, we had processions, and the ceremony was on a dais in front of the courthouse. Began with the national anthem, a few speeches and so on, and Mr. Peacock was thanked, as he was mainly responsible for the completion of the Carillon. But interestingly, during his address, the Mayor said, "I desire to offer to the citizens of Bathurst District my sincere and heartfelt congratulations for their courage, determination, outstanding citizenship and loyalty in the erection and completion of this noble monument to the memory of the sons of Bathurst District who gave their lives for the cause of empire, the highest possible price we can pay for the upholding of our national honour and national ideals. It is a memorial which is beauty of conception, in skill of execution and strength of appeal. Can I feel sure bear favourable comparison with any other the world over? This campanile is to be the property of the citizens of Bathurst and District, and will be held in sacred trust for them for all time." At the conclusion, the Mayor was given a golden key, and he went over to the tower. There were flags draped across the doors, you can see up in the top one. Those were drawn aside, and he used the key to officially open the Carillon. It was followed by the first recital, which was performed by Mr. A.B.B. Runclod, the Honorary Carillonist at Sydney University. And the memorial was dedicated the following day when 2,000 people gathered for a dedication service at 3 o'clock, during which the chaplain, Colonel Chaplain James Green, Senior Chaplain of the Forces, dedicated the memorial saying, "Almighty God, we do dedicate the memorial and set apart this Tower of Bells that it may be the fullest memorial to the men of Bathurst and District who served their king and country in the Great War. May the sound of these bells be acceptable to God." And the service was concluded with the singing of the national anthem, followed by another Carillon recital. Okay, in the days before the official opening, Mr. Peacock had said £7,711, 10 shillings and 2 pennies, tuppence, had been expended, and the outstanding debt was still approximately £428 and 4 shillings. Now, the visit of the Duke of Gloucester proved to be one of those opportunities for fundraising because it gathered a lot of people. The Duke of Gloucester's visit was a very short one on Tuesday the 27th of November 1934. Hector Lupp, who was playing the Carillon at the time, gave a recital of patriotic airs as the Duke was driven from the railway station through Macadie Park around to the Carillon for the civic reception. He was here for a whole half hour. That was the whole time of his visit, but thousands of people gathered to see him. So this was an ideal opportunity for fundraising, and what did they sell were these little pins, which the National Advocate noted that they were exquisitely designed replica of a Carillon bell on a pin, which will serve as a unique souvenir of the occasion, will be sold by a band of enthusiastic ladies whose one desire is to see the debt paid. The pins were sold for £1 each, or as much as could be spared. Another 2 years would pass before the debt was finally cleared, and in September 1936 they had £40 and 11 shillings in hand. They cleared the debt. So the committee decided to turn to the unfinished parts of the Carillon, which included foot and hand claviers to get the best results from the musical instrument. They wanted a stairway up to the top. That never happened because there were absolutely, as you can imagine, spectacular views up there. And they also wanted to ensure that the muniment room needed furnishing in keeping of the object for which the memorial was erected. Peacock noted, these matters were in the original design which the committee so far has been unable to complete. 1938 was a big year. Bathurst had embraced the title of Carillon City. There were competitions, there were events. Just about everything that happened in Bathurst had the Carillon as part of its name. Webb & Co. for the sesquicentenary at that time had the Carillon as part of its float, and the musical of the bells was regularly heard in recitals. On the 6th of October 1937, Hector Lupp, who was aged 28 at the time, was appointed the first official Carillonist. Hector played his first practice session at the Carillon keyboard on the 4th of January 1934, and the following night he gave his first recital, which had the Bathurst Times reporting that it was his second performance, and Bathurst is to be congratulated, we think, upon the possession of a musician who so thoroughly appreciates the type of music of which the Carillon is capable. In addition to playing, Hector voluntarily maintained the mechanism and bells. His appointment was for 12 months. He was to perform 25 recitals, 20 of which were to be on dates in consultation with the district band, just to ensure there weren't any performance clashes, and 5 other recitals were to be held in reserve for special occasions. His remuneration was 25 guineas per annum. But unfortunately, by November, the committee had to admit defeat. They could not complete the memorial, so they handed it over to the council on the 2nd of November that year, asking them to keep it in trust for the people of Bathurst, just as the Mayor had said on the opening occasion. They appealed to the council to ensure that the original intention was completed with the names of soldiers suitably recorded and housed within the tower, and that ways and means be found to install foot and hand claviers for the Carillon, and also, if possible, they still wanted their stairway. So, what happened over the years? There have been many changes. The installation of the eternal flame was the first, the eternal flame being the most sacred and cherished symbol of remembrance, and it was the first big change to the tower, to the Carillon. Whether in the form of a flame, a lamp or a torch, its constant light shows that the memory of those who gave their lives in the service of their country will never end. Architect John Moore had intended there would be a torch installed shortly after the official opening, and there were suggestions that a light of remembrance could be placed on top of the tower. But it wasn't until 1965 that an eternal flame was installed. It required quite a considerable amount of work. The bottom floor was modified so that a roof could be put in. The heavy doors were replaced by those metal doors to enable the flame to be seen by those passing by. And those doors record the dates 1914 to 18, 1939 to 45, together with the symbols of each of the armed forces and legacy, and the words "lest we forget." The eternal flame was opened at the dawn service on Anzac Day 1965 by Roy Dennis from the World War I Army, Theo Thompson, World War I Australian Flying Corps, Alex Bedwell, World War II Navy, and Legacy Ward Lynn Sandell. Over the years, there have been lots of plaques placed on the building, because no longer is it just the memorial for the First World War, but for every other conflict that's happened since, and also peacekeeping operations. There have been some significant ones placed. I guess one of those, there's names of different conflicts. There's the role of those who paid is the word I'm looking for, the supreme sacrifice in the Great War, and that was installed on the William Street site in 2015. The nurses of the Great War were acknowledged on a plaque that was unveiled in 2018, and there's recognition of Victoria Cross winner Lieutenant Colonel Blair Anderson. But that's not all the story. A town clock. We know it as a town clock. We hear the Westminster chimes. between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. each day. But the story of a town clock goes back a bit. A clock was installed in the courthouse, which was opened in 1880, but by 1892 people were complaining, we haven't got a town clock because it's unreliable. You can't hear it chime, and you can't even tell what time it is unless you stand directly in front of it. So the Progress Society at the time came up with the idea that a four-face clock could go on top of the courthouse. That wasn't accepted, but the desire for a town clock remained. In 1905, a clock was proposed as the appropriate memorial for the South African War. That's what you see there on the left-hand side of the screen. It was designed by local architect John Copeman, and it was to take the form of a clock tower to be erected in the centre of the intersection of George and Russell Streets, and that the streets be widened for the inclusion of the corner of Macadie Park and the corner of the Market Square. It was going to be a brick tower to start with, and that was rejected because they thought it just looked like a chimney stack. So he redesigned it in white Kalula marble, so that's going to the other extreme, with 4 clock dials, 6 feet in diameter, with a copper dome on top, and it was to go on the William Street end of the Market Square. This again was rejected in favour of the Boer War Memorial that we know today, which was designed by Copeman and the figure by Sydney sculptor Gilbert Doble. But the idea of a clock still didn't go away. And in 1911, the King's Parade Beautification Committee wanted a clock included in the centre of the parade, but that wasn't included in Jack Kenny's new design. But the idea remained, and it's quite evident that it was very firmly in the mind of people, because when you go back to that earlier slide where there was a page of writing from the committee, the image in the corner looked pretty much like that. That must be what they thought they would turn into a carillon, a tower, a clock, whatever. The question was again raised in 1983 in conjunction with the refurbishment of the carillon, which would involve $35,000 being spent on roofing, structural work, and the installation of an electronic playing system. That system was installed in April 1985 to commemorate Bathurst's civic centenary, 100 years since being proclaimed a city. The electronic system changed the way that the bells were played. So instead of bells being rung by their clapper on the inside, big hammers, which you can see up the top there, were placed on the outside, and they struck the outside of the bell, giving a very different sound. So the sound that we were all familiar with up until a couple of years ago was the constant same volume of that hammer on the outside of the bells. So with the inclusion of the Westminster chimes, Bathurst finally had its town clock. What was intended originally, or what was programmed in originally, was that on the hour you would get the deep tolling, but they also intended that 10 seconds later there'd be tolling again at a higher level. Never happened. 37 tunes are in the system, or were put in the system at the time, that could be programmed to be heard at 9 a.m, noon, 1 p.m and 5 p.m on weekdays, and longer recitals on weekends. However, we only ever hear one very short tune at 12 and 1. Over the years, that system has been upgraded, and it's been upgraded, and there are more tunes there, but we still only hear those few there. It's played by either electronically or by an electronic keyboard. But there were further changes afoot. When the old All Saints Cathedral was demolished in 1970, its beautiful old bells, 6 of them, were put into storage. And around 1997, the Dean of the Cathedral came up with the idea that those bells could be installed in the carillon. That we could have, on an upper floor, the change ringing bells and the carillon bells further up. The proposal was quite a contentious one. Bell ringers were very much in favour. Those who understood the purpose of the memorial were very much against it. Taylor's design here, they thought it was quite doable because they had always intended that a clavier was going up higher. And they figured, well, why isn't the clavier there? Get one, put it up higher, put the change ringing bells where the playing floor was, and we'll build another floor a bit further down so that it can actually ring the bells. Fortunately, that one didn't happen. I think that would be a great misfortune, but we were lucky that instead they did go ahead and build a tower at All Saints. Working Party was established in 2000, having got this idea that there should have been a clavier there in the first place. It was reborn. Working Party was established, and for the next 20 years, the journey would continue. And that would include another organisation called the Bathurst War Memorial Carillon Fund Trust and the Carillon Group that started in 2017. As the years progressed, it became apparent that that was going to be no easy task. In fact, the bells were going to need work. So the first job was back in 2004. They needed a new frame because that one was too weak. The bells themselves needed to be refurbished. So they were all taken out, worked on by a local engineering company and replaced. In 2017, it became apparent that, or we were advised, that the upper tier of the old bells needed to be replaced, and the opportunity was taken to buy another 12 bells to bring the total up to 47. Those upper bells, little bells, are known as the peace bells, and the three previously unnamed bells are inscribed Black Springs, Bathurst, Hilland and Tambaroora. And you can see there the difference between those bells. The one down the bottom in the centre, beautiful old bell, ornate, they're absolutely glorious. The one in the centre, the new replaced bells and the additional bells are a very different style to the others. So we now have a mixture of bells in the tower. In 2018, those new bells, additional bells and replaced bells were put back into the tower in November 2018. Okay, those new clappers that you can see down the bottom, that's not connected there, but they were getting ready to be connected to the wires to the clavier. So the bells now have the big hammer on the outside, so they can be played electronically and we can still have our town clock, and the clappers on the inside to go with the clavier. New eternal flame was necessary, and that was probably the most difficult challenge of the lot, because it needed to be replaced because of the soot from the way the gas flame needed to burn an orange flame, so that it could be seen, but it also produced huge soot deposits all the way up through the tower, so they needed to be replaced. It wasn't a popular move in any shape or form, because to the return service personnel, the flame holds those memories. It's the most precious thing they've got in their war memorial. They're not particularly worried about the carillon or the tower, but that eternal flame was so incredibly important. So a replacement was really, really difficult. The sub-branch put out a bit of a search, and they've decided they wanted to contact a Blue Mountain sculptor, Terence Plowright, OAM, and he was invited to submit potential for possible designs. He's well known as a sculptor. He has works all around the country. Some of his better known ones are the Blackstone and Lawson figures for the crossing of the Blue Mountains, Richie Benno and Steve Waugh at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and the Brolgers down in Cockle Bay. It worked extensively on cenotaphs and had a good understanding of what was required for a war memorial. What he submitted were 10 really contemporary designs. Really contemporary designs. This one was selected as being the one most in keeping with the memorial. So the old eternal flame was removed in a short ceremony on the Friday the 12th of April 2019. It was taken away and cleared, and it's down in the RSL's museum. Anzac Day service on 2019 was attended by a large crowd of around 3,000, and the flame was again lit. Well, the new flame was turned on, would be more to the point, because this one wasn't lit per se. It was switched on by Alex Bedwell, who had turned on the first eternal flame. There were 4 other veterans in attendance: Dick Crossing, Ian Brewer, Fred Anderson and Frank Kirby. And at the end of that service, the flame room, the eternal flame room, was opened up for people to walk through, and the same thing happened at the citizen ceremony. So people were asked to walk through, pay their respects, place a piece of rosemary, and that's a new tradition that started at that time. So where are we up to? I've got that. There was something else that was needed, and it was a clavier, to be able to play the bells properly. From the outset, it was always intended so that the bells would have their full dynamic expression. However, the fear of the committee was that there would be nobody around who'd be able to play it. Sydney University had got the same sort of pneumatic system that we got in the first place, but they brought somebody out and had trained them very quickly to play a carillon. So when Mr. Peacock asked for a quote from Taylor's, he said, "We have decided to temporarily dispense with the clavier and wish the quotation to include a mechanical player with electro-pneumatic pistons, controlled by an ivory keyboard, the touch to be identical to that of an organ, so that an organist can play the instrument. We will also require the instrument to be so arranged that a clavier can be installed later." Following the opening, the paying off of the debt, there was no willingness whatsoever to raise any more funds. In early 1945, Mr. Peacock, he clearly was passionate about completing this project. He suggested that the completion of the carillon of the War Memorial would be an ideal memorial to the service personnel of the Second World War. But unfortunately, that didn't happen either. What did happen was many years went by. In 2000, the need for the clavier came to the fore again, because on the 25th of January, Mr. Adrian Gabrus, I probably pronounced that wrongly, of St Coleman's Cathedral in Cobbin Island, and President of the World Carillon Federation, visited Bathurst with Dr. Jill Forrest, President of the Carillon Society of Australia. When he inspected the playing mechanism, he refused to play. He said that Bathurst does not have a carillon. There are no clappers operated by a clavier console. That galvanised community action, and through plenty of iterations over 20 years, a clavier was finally installed in November 2020. The clavier and bells were commissioned in a ceremony on the 21st of May 2021, and the singing tower now has its full voice. However, there is still one more project before the original vision for Bathurst War Memorial Carillon is complete. John, would you please tell us a little bit about the one thing that is still to be done?
Okay, thanks, Jan. In concert with the original designing and construction of the carillon was a monument room in which would be housed a book which would initially list all of the servicemen and women from Bathurst District who served in the First World War. That never happened. And in hindsight, those men and women that were considering that would not have envisaged world history post-opening of the carillon. So 5 years ago or more, I started up a team of researchers within the RSL sub-branch, and we are working on a Book of Remembrance. Now, that Book of Remembrance will contain the names of something like 1,500 people from Bathurst and District who served and paid the supreme sacrifice. The second part of that is the original vision that included all those who served. We have painstakingly gone through probably 30,000 names from the 1840s to the 60s for those who were recruited locally, who served in the New Zealand Maori Wars, and conflicts subsequent to that, up to as close to modern day where we can get records. And from about the first Gulf War, they're virtually non-existent. So, at the end of this month, the research of those names is meant to be complete, and I hope that will be very close to what will happen. The next stage is to get the Book of Remembrance actually validated, into print and ready for presentation from the President of the RSL sub-branch to the Mayor of Bathurst Regional Council on Remembrance Day 2023, the 90th anniversary of the opening of the Carillon. But we are not in a position to put that in the Carillon. We had monitors in the Carillon for 8 months, and our Conservative has determined that a paper book would have a lifespan of somewhere between 5 and 7 years due to humidity issues. So we will present that book to the Mayor, and the Council, I'm sure, will find an appropriate place to put it, which won't be in the Carillon. But being the electronic age, we will also present files that will be loaded onto computer systems within the sub-branch, and probably the Council and anyone else that wants it, of a list of names of all those that we have been able to identify who have served from Bathurst and District. So what is Bathurst and District? Basically, it's the old city of Bathurst, the Turin Shire and the Abercrombie Shire, which later translated to Bathurst Regional Council, and in the interim Bathurst City Council and Evans Shire. So that's what we've been whiling our spare hours away for the last 5 years, and I'm hopeful, well, it's going to happen. On the 11th of November 2023, that book and that list of names will be presented to the community of Bathurst.
Thanks, John. That's a huge amount of work. Thank you. That's a huge amount of work. Okay, so where are we up to? From the first recitals on the 11th of November 1933, the sound of the bells became very much a familiar feature of Bathurst, and many Carillonists have played that ivory keyboard over the years, although technically not Carillonists as we now know, and they've played electronic keyboards. Playing has been part of the commemorative services, of civic events, acknowledgement of significant occasions, including various events associated with Queen Elizabeth II and the death of Ben Chifley, and recitals for the community's enjoyment. Bathurst now has 3 wonderful, fully trained Carillonists, Jennifer Roberts, Denise Garland and Wendy Murphy, who play our War Memorial Carillon for commemoration, celebration and entertainment. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce 3 lovely ladies to you who can tell you a little bit about what they've been up to. They can tell their own stories. Thank you.
So, good evening everyone. Will I speak on behalf?
So much material up there. Just as well we've got the photo up there.
Yeah. So, Denise and I answered an ad that we saw in the paper early 2019, I think it was. You know, that Bathurst was seeking Carillonists, and you know, we've got this amazing structure in the middle of town, and as experienced musicians, you know, we're always looking for something a little bit new and different. And as Jan's explained, the tower wasn't ready for us yet, but Denise and I went down to Canberra, had a couple of lessons on the Carillon down there with Lynn Fuller, who you saw in a slide earlier, and we were hooked. And I think that excitement rifled through Mitchell Conservatorium, which is where the practice clavier is held, and Jennifer has an association with Mitchell Conservatorium, and she joined the training squad, so we became the Three Musketeers. It's been a fraught journey, as most things have been over the last couple of years, you know, with the pandemic, dare I say. But we are really thrilled that you know, we're out the other end of that, and you know, working very closely with Lynn in Canberra. We've completed our assessment recital, so the spring recital series last year, and now we're just looking forward to taking every opportunity we can to play the tower, to bring a wide variety of music. I think it's great with the three of us. We all have very different musical backgrounds. We all have very different tastes in music that we can play for you. So what we're now looking for are more musicians to learn the Carillon, because the more we have, the more variety that the Bathurst community will hear on those occasions. So that's really us in a nutshell. Is there anything else? No?
Perfect. Thank you. We are just so lucky to have the three of you. So,
We do practice hard.
they've done a fabulous job and did that in a very short amount of time. So we're really lucky to have the music that now comes from our War Memorial Carillon. I guess we can say that finally it has its proper voice after a lot of years. So that's kind of it for me today. Any questions anyone's got?
How long does it take to learn? Is it a hard instrument?
I don't think we'll ever finish.
And you don't have any music there?
Oh yes, we do.
Where?
We normally put music on the big wooden frame there.
If you go back a slide and show Lynn playing,
She has music.
yeah,
Oh,
she's got
yes.
music there. Yeah,
Yeah.
And it's the same music?
it's normal piano music.
Normal piano.
Yeah.
And it's slightly different because the stems go up or down, and so basically the stems that go up for your right hand, the stems that go down are for your left hand to play, and the ones on the bass clef are for your feet to play the pedals. So it's slightly different than piano music, but you can still play piano music and you can still play regular tunes that, as you know, as you might hear on Anzac Day or any time we're playing. So it is like that, but all of us have done a certain level of piano qualifications before we took it on, and you don't just go in if you've never played the piano, so that's probably the secret. You need to be quite advanced at the piano before you even tackle it, yes.
Chris?
Can I ask which of the ladies was playing the theme from Star Wars the other day? For those who pick it up, it was great.
We've had a request from Dan Cove for May the 4th, so we've got, and Canberra have done it, they do a May the 4th recital, so they send us their music. Correct, yes, so, and that just coincides with one of the lunchtime tours. Where, you know, we like to take requests, and you know, given a certain amount of time, we will, you know, do our best, so I'm glad.
So it was noticed.
Yeah.
Quite a few people, I think.
So yes, the music is for commemoration or celebration or straight out entertainment. Okay. Which is fantastic. Any other questions?
I noticed in a slide earlier, in the top right hand corner there was a crane. Was that crane bringing the stuff down through the top of the, so they open up the top to,
They took the roof off and put the bells in, the frames in, yep, and then put it all
And put
back.
the roof
So
back
it's quite a huge job.
well,
Anyone
they're
who
pretty hard to bring it up from the bottom, aren't they?
in the original case, because everything went up from the bottom. Originally, the tower was built from the inside, and I still haven't worked out exactly how they did it, because they had their platforms on the inside, and as they laid their bricks, they moved the platforms up and ladders and what have you. There's a very, very dodgy picture which I couldn't put up here, it's just too pixelated from a newspaper, where you can see on the Church Street side, obviously bricks, mortar being made. There's a, what am I trying to say? A winch type system up the top to drag stuff up through the middle. So everything went up that way. It's quite amazing, and when you think about the amount of time and the intricacies of some of that brickwork, it's quite fascinating. I'm always in awe of that building and the people who did so much to build it in the first place. But those two pictures there show you very much the difference in playing, because here's old Harry Tooby there. The little keyboard is literally that size, one note for each of the bells, so it's a little piano type keyboard. The clavier is a much different story altogether, and you can see that it's a very different playing mechanism. Okay, so just thank you for everybody for coming, and to Bathurst District Historical Society for letting us do that presentation, to the Carillonists, to John, to the Historical Society, John Telfer and other people who've provided those various photos. And I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of some key resources, because I have just this year been able to access the archives of John Taylor, which has changed the story just a little bit as we find out just how this all came about. Also a collection of documents from Dr. Jill Forrest, who was very much part of getting the clavier into the Carillon in the first place, has also shed a lot of light. And I have to say thank you to Trove, and we can all be very grateful that it's now been paid for. Thank you very much, and it will continue. So as this is the 90th anniversary, you'll be very much aware that we're right at the beginning of it. And the next part is literally what we call Memorial Week. It's the week from the 4th to the 11th of November, which will very much be the 90th, the actual 90th. So there'll be some more recitals and tours during that particular time. Festival of Bells next week, an opportunity to hear not only the Carillon but the bells of All Saints Cathedral. And there are some other musical events that you've got on some of those leaflets. So thank you everybody. The only thing that's left now is that there is cake. So please do enjoy.
Thanks, Jan.
On behalf of the Historic Society, I'd like to thank Jan and the ladies and friends very much for coming tonight, and for providing us with cake, which is great. But the Festival of the Bells coming up end of April. The museum will be open, and we've got some of the items that you might have seen tonight on display. The key, the original key, and some of the other memorabilia. So, come along and have a look, and thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you very much, Jan, again. Thank you.
Jan?